in Beirut at the American University of Beirut. I'm very happy tonight. I'm very glad to also to welcome a fantastic lineup of speakers who are former colleagues and friends in order to tackle a very now sensitive question, which is what is to be expected from the coming Biden administration in the Middle East. We are now after the election that is still contested, probably. There is a transition period that is very probably bumpy. We'll try to get over this kind of parenthesis, although we can tackle it also. But then we will enter into the several files that the coming administration will have to take on and to really address in the region, from Iran to Libya, passing through the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Lebanon and Syria, of course, and other issues that are transnational. And to do that, we have the big opportunity to have people who are historically and today really at the core of these subjects. We have with us today or tonight, depending on the time zone you are in, Michelle Dunn, who is Carnegie's Endowment Director of the Middle East Program. Michelle is a specialist of Egypt, but also of other things in the region. She has for a very long period occupied sensitive positions in mainly democratic administrations at the National Security Council, the intelligence community, at the State Department, and I think Michelle also was posted at the consulate in Jerusalem. We also have with us tonight Aaron David Miller, who's also a Carnegie Fellow. And Aaron is well known to have, for a long time, occupied sensitive positions of advisorship in what we call in Washington the peace process business. Aaron, I think you're one of the veterans of this business, and you also accompanied several administrations in the U.S., both Democrat and Republican, so you can have a very synthetic view of the changes and shifts in American policy towards the Middle East. And with you, we will enter into these intricacies of the administration. Then Jumana Kadur, who is a Syrian-American prominent figure today in DC. Jumana has several hats. She's both at Georgetown and also at the Atlantic Council, where she holds the Syrian portfolio. And without disclosing any secret, Jumana has been very active in several Democratic campaigns, in the primary with former candidate Buttigieg, and then with the Biden campaign on the Syrian issue, feeding the campaign with proposals on Syria. So we will have a lot to hear from you, Jumana, on this issue. And last but definitely not least, Charles Tepeau, a French diplomat seconded to the WINEP, to Washington Institute for Near East Policy. But the caveat very quickly I say is that Charles will completely express himself tonight as a researcher, as a WINEP, as a scholar WINEP, and not at all as a French diplomat, although Charles for a very long time has also occupied sensitive positions in Berlin and in Europe on Syria, Iraq, and mainly on the anti-ISIS coalition campaign. And Charles has a very acute reading of the transatlantic relations related to this region, to the Middle East. Let me start by putting a question to all of you, one question to all of you, just to heat up the debate. And I'll require a short answer, 3 minutes maybe, to each one of you. The question is, Donald Trump is unanimously considered as a very disruptive figure in the American politics. To what extent Donald Trump really marked a very radical bifurcation in terms of American foreign policy towards the Middle East, despite or besides his own character, and to what extent, after such a radical departure, could a Biden administration really get back things to normal, quote unquote, or to a more classical way of doing politics towards the Middle East in Washington? Michelle, would you start?
Thank you, Joseph. I'm very happy to be with you. Look, I think, there are ways in which President Trump took longstanding tendencies in US policies toward the Middle East and just made them more extreme and more crude and without nuance. For example, the US tendency to support Israel, often at the expense of the Palestinians, the U.S. tensions with Iran and tendency to try to put pressure on Iran, and also the U.S. support for leaders in the region, many times authoritarian. But Trump just, he took all of this to an extreme. The other thing was that Trump had a very different way of making decisions and of conducting relations. He had these very unusual relationships with a whole group of leaders in the region, whether we're talking about Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed in UAE, Erdogan in Turkey, Netanyahu in Israel, Sisi in Egypt. He had this strange way of making special deals with them, doing favors for them and expecting favors in return. And these deals and these favors often were not really connected to American national security interests. This is the thing that I expect to change under Biden. I mean, under Trump, the normal kind of policy processes, interagency decision-making, and so forth, and consultation with Congress, it just wasn't happening. I think that a lot of that is going to come back under a Biden administration. That doesn't mean, and Biden he's already promised to reverse a lot of specific steps that President Trump has taken, but he's not going to reverse all of them. And, and some of these longstanding tendencies in US policy, I think will still be there under a Biden administration. But Biden is, he's going to try to, US presidents, especially when it's a different party, they often start out saying, I'm going to do the opposite of what my predecessor did. So certainly on things like speaking about human rights and allying with other democracies and so forth, Biden's going to bring a lot of those more familiar aspects of US foreign policy back.
Okay. Aaron, your 2 cents?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Look, I think the main takeaway from Donald Trump and why it's worth focusing on your question is that, in a way, he is linked both to his predecessor, Barack Obama, and to his successor, Joe Biden, in one fundamental respect as pertains to the Middle East. I mean, he was a disruptor. And disruption in and of itself is not a bad policy if, in fact, it serves the national interests. Donald Trump's dominant theme through his foreign policy was to tether America's national interests to his own political interests, to the interests of his domestic politics, to his own ego and his own vanity. But I think the continuity here, and Michelle and I have talked about this, we may not be in complete agreement, is that Trump continued a trend set in the Obama administration of the diminishing importance of the region. And I suspect if there's any takeaway from the Trump administration under Joe Biden, it will be the notion that the Middle East is not as important to American national interests as it used to be. And the reasons are quite compelling on paper. Now, as Michelle reminds me, many American presidents have sought to disengage and then found themselves dragged back in. But from the standpoint of strict American national interest, you can make an argument briefly for the following. The US is no longer dependent on Arab hydrocarbons. Iraq and Afghanistan have proven to be trillion-dollar social science projects. Tremendous investment, tremendous destruction on the part of the United States to the Afghan people, to the Iraqi people, but also tremendous destruction to our own credibility, our own young men and women, and our own resources. Combine that with the reality of shifting priorities, a rising China, for example, and the reality that Joe Biden will confront the greatest challenge of national recovery since any American president, since Franklin Roosevelt. And I suspect that the one thing that ties them all together is an unwillingness to intervene in what you might call discretionary enterprises and discretionary interests, and to focus on what is vital. And I suspect that Biden, so preoccupied with crises, will try to identify one or two issues in this region that he must attend to.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. We'll get back to these issues after hearing Joumana's 2 cents and then Charles. Joumana, your impression about the shift or the lack of.
Sure, thank you. And Joe, if you don't mind, I just want to make one thing clear, is that although I was a volunteer on those campaigns, I in no way speak on behalf of anyone but myself. So just to make that clear. So just building off of what Aaron and Michelle have said, I agree with what they've said, so I don't want to repeat it, but I think, I think what Trump was able to do, that I do think we can, that a Biden administration can and should benefit from, is his unconventional and bullish character was able to push sort of the envelope on the norms of diplomacy, expectations from both our allies and our about what we may or may not do. And, it may be unpopular to say, and that while anticipating behavior, from the United States is a good thing. I think we might also be able to use this opportunity to break away from longstanding behaviors that the United States may have been too timid or too conservative to approach before. And especially because the region is not what it was 8 years ago, let alone what it was 4 years ago. And I hear a lot of talk about, this as being an Obama 2.0 administration. Even if you were to bring the same characters, the challenges are incredibly different. We have new power centers in the region. The UAE and Turkey have emerged. The traditional characters continue to fall by the wayside, like Egypt and Iraq. They're embroiled in their own issues. And there might be new ways and room for creative thinking, especially as new, I think, foreign policy professionals come in. This is one of the benefits, I think, having volunteered on for example, the Buttigieg campaign, is that Buttigieg, for him as a person, came with new and fresh ideas that maybe, much more seasoned diplomats would have never considered. And finally, I would say that what may be beneficial is that, Trump, he did away with the notion that we will always continue to fund programs or support programs indefinitely. And I think this especially touches on, when we talk about Syria and Lebanon later, is that, unless you can prove that a program or US funding is really, funding in that way is beneficial for US, short, medium, or long-term interests, that kind of support from the United States is not going to continue. The US has domestic concerns and domestic issues that need to be funded that have not been given, I think, due attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Joumana. Last, Charles, before we get into the issues, your 2 cents on this issue, Biden, Trump continuity or change?
I think I can only echo what my colleagues said, and I think I would just stress maybe 3 points to add to what they already mentioned. I think when we talk about disruption, the biggest difference we might see with the Biden administration is a renewal of the diplomatic process, the way it used to work in more classical tradition. A consequence of the Trump disruption was the paralysis of a number of tracks, channels of negotiation and dialogues in the region, and the inability for a number of players, including the Europeans, to use these channels to shape or influence or exchange on certain crises like Syria or Libya. I think we'll see a comeback to this normal process of diplomacy, but as Joumana mentioned, there is also a need for innovation, because I guess we'll go back to the GCPOA and other issues like this, but the kind of frameworks that existed before Trump have been challenged, and so their relevance cannot be taken for granted. And so there will be a need for reinvestment in these processes. The second point I want to make, and which echoes, I think, Aaron's point regarding the decreasing interest for the Middle East in the US, I think a word I've been hearing a lot in DC in the last year has been the word bandwidth. Is there enough bandwidth in the US government to take care of this, to be invested in this? And I think that's a point of continuity between Trump and Biden, because given the domestic situation in the US, given the pandemics and all this, I think the bandwidth of the US government to deal with Middle Eastern crisis will be more limited, no matter what is the intent and no matter what is the process behind. And so this calls for a reframing of a number of issues to make sure that whatever constructive contribution the US can make, it has to be within a more narrower and a humbler framework. And the third point I want to make to add to this is that we've seen, I mean, if we come back to the history of the Bush administration with this idea of promoting democracy with a certain conceptual ambition for the region, I think the Trump mandate has definitely killed this. And so we've seen in recent years a lack of conceptual framework being proposed or imposed or suggested by the US. And a big question mark for me is whether a Biden administration bring back some conceptual proposal for security architecture in the Gulf, for instance, or to add a regional layer to the nuclear agreement. All these questions are very complicated, and it remains to be seen whether the bandwidth of the next US government will allow to have some deeper conceptual work about how you create a track for de-escalation in a number of situations, how you engage in a more sustainable dialogue with regional parties.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you all. Now we'll turn to a more issue-by-issue or file-by-file approach, and you'll take a little bit more time. But what you just said is a perfect transition to engage Aaron on certain issues. When you talk about bandwidth, when you talk about classical diplomatic processes, etc., the first thing that comes to mind is of course the oldest conflict in the region, and probably the structural conflict of the region, although we tend to consider it less central today, namely the Arab-Israeli question or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Aaron, as we said in introduction, you're a veteran of this peace process business. Do you think first that this will remain on the radar? Second, the issue of bandwidth is very much related to the structuring of the new administrations in terms of human resources, of names, of people, etc. Do you already have a 2 cents on this? And do you think that these people are bringing with them in their cartons the culture of the peace process to be relaunched? And what is to be expected from this new administration in terms of, let us say, relaunching certain classical processes, as Charles was saying, whereby there is less appetite in the region, in several capitals of the region, for such a thing. And as Michel said, people, or at least autocrats in the region, have been used now after 4 years of Trump of exchanging favors and not so much processes. So if we try to answer all this together, what would you say about that?
Well, if we tried to answer all of that together, Joe, we'd all be here probably till tomorrow morning. I would only, I would only say a few things. There's a paradox here. I would not identify, I think the Americans have 3 vital interests in the Middle East. And when I say vital, I mean interests around which an American president would be willing to expend the lives of American troops, interests around which the United States would be prepared to expend whatever resources were required, and interests around which the United States would be prepared to expend its credibility, its believability, its capacity to be taken seriously. And I would argue to you that we have not been admired and respected in the Middle East since the last most effective Secretary of State for whom I worked, and that was James Baker and Bush 41. So the Arab-Israeli peace process is not vital to American interests. It is not going to affect American security or prosperity. There was a time when people believed, in essence, that it might. But the Middle East landscape, the Arab-Israeli landscape, has so profoundly changed and to a large degree stabilized, particularly with the onset of the unexpected Abraham Accords, that the prospects of the Arab-Israeli issue affecting any of America's core interests, I think are remote. But at the same time, even though it's not a vital interest, the bandwidth, and Charles's notion is absolutely correct, that's a wonderful word, the bandwidth for dealing with this issue, not dealing with it comprehensively, but being active on it in a way that will appear to undo much of the damage that the Trump administration has done, the bandwidth is actually quite large, because many things can be done on this issue. I call it low-hanging fruit that can be picked from the lower part of the tree without expending tremendous resources. And I think that herein lies the paradox. So do I think that the Biden administration will launch into a comprehensive effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli conflict? Do I think they're going to appoint a special Middle East envoy? Can you still hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
You can. Do I think they're going to appoint a Middle East envoy out of the White House? Absolutely not. Do I think they're going to call for a comprehensive settlements freeze, including East Jerusalem? No. But I do think that they will do certain things. They're going to restore the dialogue with the Palestinian Authority, I think, at a sufficiently high level. They will be able to begin to consider refunding UNRWA. They may decide, even though opening up the PLO mission here is tangled inextricably with certain congressional legislation that restricts it and requires the Palestinians to do some things, but they may decide to create or redesignate a separate entity to deal directly with Palestinians. And they will speak and create a frame of reference that will sound better, more credible to the ears of Arabs, Israelis, and people interested in this, at least for openers. And I think, frankly, that might be sufficient. That might be necessary, not sufficient, to at least begin to repair some of the damage that has been done. To go further and to try their hand at actually resolving the issues that over the last 20 years, since the Camp David summit in July of 2000, Israelis and Palestinians, even with American help, have never been able to resolve, and I would argue can't resolve now, is probably a bridge too far. But I think you will see, paradoxically, a lot of energy expended in a limited way for what the administration may well believe is maximum return, at least at this point.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. But let me follow up with a very quick question. Do you think that, and this has few to do with what Trump did, in fact, exactly, it has more to do with reality itself in the region, but you still think that a two-state solution is physically or realistically feasible today, or do we have all of us, the American administration included, to change the software with which we approach this question and project ourselves in a kind of now binational state, let's say, context and different struggle for the Palestinians in the region?
I've given up most of my illusions, Joseph, on the issue of how easy it would be to produce such a thing. I haven't given up hope, and I would identify, I would say to you that if you gave me three things, or even two of the three things I'm going to identify, I'd give you a reasonable chance of creating a negotiation that could produce such an outcome. Number one, you need leaders on both sides who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies or their constituencies. You do not have that. Number two, you need a sense of ownership. You need Israelis and Palestinians to care more and to invest more in these negotiations than any outside party. It's no coincidence that every breakthrough, without exception, every one, Egypt-Israel, Israel-Palestinians, and Jordan-Israel, occurred without the foreknowledge of the United States. And finally, you're going to need an administration that is prepared to apply both honey and vinegar, incentives and disincentives, as an effective mediator. Those are the three things you need. Give me one of the first two and the third, and I'll give you a chance. I do not believe in thought experiments. I do not believe in creating alternatives that seem to me are so distant, so impossible, so implausible, that they frankly distract attention from what may still yet be, and I'm under no illusions here, none, the possibility of separating through negotiations, which to me is the only way to actually even hope to address the demographic, political, psychological, and historical factors that have driven Israelis and Palestinians into conflict.
Okay, I see. In fact, this adds to the thing that we all say, that in fact the world has changed as much as Washington has changed during these 4 years. So in fact, any new president is today approaching a world that is starkly different from what we used to know. Michel, you alluded in your introductory remarks to the question of human rights and things related to public freedoms, legal norms, and etc. Trump is well known to have labeled President Sisi of Egypt his favorite dictator, which is also a way, as you said, to say or to plainly say the unsaid in Washington. I mean, every administration in Washington had its favorite dictators, but Trump had maybe the guts to say it. I don't know. But do you think that the new administration will be less in bed, let's say, with someone like Sisi? Will the human rights issue be at the core of, or somewhere within the American software towards the region? Does this apply also to other dictators, be them favorites or less favorites in the Gulf or elsewhere, nearby here in Syria or elsewhere? And what will this tell us about the behavior that the Biden administration will take towards countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar sometime, and others?
Thank you, Joe. Joe, I am going to address this question, but I want to just make two very quick points, one responding to Aaron and one to something that Charles said. On Aaron's point, I quite agree with him that regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that leadership, ownership, and a mix of honey and vinegar would help. But in terms of the viability of a two-state solution, there's just one thing that has destroyed the two-state solution, and that is Israeli settlements. If there were not Israeli settlements built up and down the West Bank, none of us would today be saying a two-state solution has become impossible. All of these other elements, of course, are very helpful, but I think we would still be able to see a viable two-state solution in front of us had had Israel not settled its civilians up and down all through the West Bank. So I just want to say that, and I think that the people in the new administration will see that. I don't expect them to necessarily take on the settlements issue in a big way, the way President Obama did in the beginning of his presidency, partly because they don't see other elements in place that would allow them to make progress. But I just think that has to be said. Regarding Charles' point too, Charles made this point about whether there's going to be a new conceptual framework, a new US security framework. That's an incredibly important question, because as the US wants to withdraw its security presence, at least to diminish it, maybe not to completely end it, but to diminish its security presence in the Middle East. The argument that we're going to have in Washington, and in fact has already started, is, does this mean that the US should arm its allies in this region to the teeth? There's been this enormous, potential arms sale to the UAE that the Trump administration has already notified to Congress, and we're already seeing senators in Congress objecting to it for several reasons, but one of them is setting off an enormous arms race in the region. And the last thing I want to say about this is I think it has been a tragedy, and I'd love to hear Charles comment on this, that what the United States and Europe have been doing in the Middle East is competing for arms sales. That it is we, our countries, and nobody else who is arming and fueling the conflicts in the Middle East with our arms sales. So, all right, I'll leave that alone. Now on the issue of human rights and so forth. Look, what I think is important here is that I think President-elect Biden is going to come into office without feeling that he owes any of these leaders in the region, autocratic leaders like Sisi, anything. He doesn't owe them anything. President Trump behaved as though he owed them things. And frankly, we still don't really know what that was all about. Little things have emerged here and there, but I don't think President Biden is going to behave that way. I also don't think that President-elect Biden is going to come into office wanting to pick fights with all these leaders, including Sisi. Now, the one thing that Biden said about Egypt and Sisi during his campaign came in the form of a tweet where he said, "No more blank checks for Trump's favorite dictator." So, what that implies is that, there will be different criteria applied to decisions about Egypt going forward. Jomana mentioned, President Trump sort of breaking up the expectation that US programs and so forth will continue indefinitely. Well, the United States has been providing $1.3 billion in security assistance, plus at times economic assistance to Egypt for more than 40 years now. Right? That's one that has gone on forever. And I think that the Egyptian government firmly expects to go on forever. I don't expect Biden to come in and cancel that aid program or something like that. But I do think questions are going to be asked about these relationships. Are they working? Is the mix of aid appropriate? And so forth. I mean, Egypt has huge economic problems. It's not at war as far as I know. So why are we providing enormous military assistance and almost no economic help? So I think those kind of questions will be asked. I do think, human rights issues will be raised. The really important, and by the way, on Saudi Arabia, Biden has promised a policy review on Saudi Arabia, a review. And I think, I can't imagine a President Biden being as willing as President Trump was to shield leaders in this region as Trump did, as Trump shielded Mohammed bin Salman from the consequences of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. I just don't see Biden operating that way. Okay, so I think it's going to be a different environment. The really big question to me, Joseph, is how, you know, US administrations always come in with plans of, oh, we're going to do this or not do that, or priorities or bandwidth. And then, as we know, things happen out there in the world, and especially in this region, things happen that were unanticipated, right? And the past several US presidents have each faced things that they did not anticipate happening in this region. What I'm thinking about is, you know, as the pandemic recedes, we may well see the unrest, you know, inside a lot of Middle East countries that we saw over the last decade, and even last year, even in 2019, in Lebanon and in many other places, we may well see this start boiling again. I think there are many unresolved issues, and I by no means think all of this is over. So the big question is, how would President Biden react to changes, to turmoil, to the possibility of governments, even governments that have been allies to the United States in this region, possibly falling? And I can't tell you where or when. Let's just say it's been happening a lot for the last decade, right? And I think his reactions, again, you know, the US, Charles is right, doesn't have the bandwidth or the arrogance anymore to go in and say, we're going to fix it, we have the solution, here's the new plan for the whole region, so forth. Still, the United States is going to have a policy, figure out how to react when things start happening in the region. And I think that Biden's reactions are going to be very different from what Trump's reactions would be if he had had a second term.
Okay, Michelle, if I can it forward or further on Egypt and what's surrounding it, out of what you just said, I mean, are we going to see the same trend towards a greater Egyptian regional role, mainly in Libya or in Sinai and etc.? And second, in the context you just described, will the inter-Gulfi competition, mainly Saudi Arabia, Emirates on the one hand, and Qatar on the other one, and Turkey behind, will it go on and reverberate on the Egyptian situation and beyond that? What's your projection about that?
Look, you know, Egypt, I do not see Egypt taking a greater regional role. I mean, I think Jamal already indicated that, you know, Egypt is in many ways a declining power, and it has been for a long time because of massive internal challenges. For example, population growth that never get addressed effectively, and therefore, you know, Egypt has become more and more dependent on outsiders, very dependent on, you know, right now on the International Monetary Fund for assistance. Egypt has taken $20 billion, you know, in loans from the International Monetary Fund in the last 5 years, and I know they will need more. They need something like $10 billion in external financing every year just to keep the government going, you know. So they have been very dependent on the Gulf, but you know, with the changing economic picture in the Gulf, as the oil era starts to decline, the Gulf is less and less able to provide the big infusions of cash, of investment, and indeed to absorb excess labor from a country like Egypt. So the Gulf is still there, and those relationships between Egypt and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are still important, but I think they're, you know, those countries in the Gulf are going to have to look to themselves and their own needs and their immediate neighborhood a little bit more, and they're not going to have as much to give to a place like Egypt. And then Egypt now has a problem with its dependency for water, you know, on Ethiopia. The fact that Egypt has benefited from underuse of Nile water by Ethiopia and Sudan forever, you know, for millennia. But that's changing now, and with Ethiopia's construction of the dam and development, agriculture and other development inside Sudan, Egypt's going to be getting less water. So this is a big problem. So what I'm saying about Egypt's role is, and then of course the border with Libya, it's a very long, porous border, and it is a serious security threat to Egypt. Egypt is just having to deal with some very immediate threats and challenges, right? And it's not able to play a role beyond that very much. And it sort of just is tagging along with the UAE and Saudi Arabia here and there. The one thing they were not willing to tag along with, interestingly, was this Arab NATO idea. There was going to be this joint Arab, military force. And what was very interesting was this was one of the things that Egypt said no to, and said no to the Trump administration. It was a Trump administration process, because I think at a certain point, I mean, putting Egyptian troops under the command potentially of a general from another country and participating in a security project that I think Egyptians saw as largely Saudi driven and really meeting Saudi interests, not addressing Egypt's security interests. So, they will, they'll follow the lead of their patrons in the Gulf, ila haddin ma, right? To a certain extent, and then they will say, wait a minute, as they did with sending ground troops to Yemen. That was too much to ask.
Okay, thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you. Jumana, Michelle mentioned the high possibility that once COVID recedes, the region get back to certain forms of popular unrest and upheaval and etc. I mean, Syria is just the case in point. Syria has probably been the main victim of the Arab Revolution and the way Washington treated them. We all know that, I mean, we both shared this conversation several times in Washington. We often consider that Syria literally or almost literally died under Obama's watch. And there were maybe hopes that things would be different after him. And then we also witnessed that things were the same under the Trump administration, namely the subcontracting of Syria to Russia, namely turning a blind eye to the regime's issue, concentrating on only some spots of Syria related to Iran and etc. The issue of Turkey in the Northeast, etc., etc. How do you see things with the Biden administration? If he comes back to an Obama software to Syria, this would be the continuation of this policy. And if he doesn't come back to that, what are the means that the US still have in order to come back to the core of the Syrian issue and participate in any form of political solution that would see a change that could be satisfactory to the Syrian people first and foremost? What did you hear during all this period in the corridors of the campaigns, and what is being brewed in the coming administration towards Syria?
Thank you, Joseph. In the Zoom corridors, right? Because no one was meeting in person. Listen, I want to start off by, yes, I think President Obama generally gets a lot of the blame for the initial sort of ineffectual addressing of the Syrian conflict, or at the end of his tenure, he left right as the fall of Aleppo was happening, right? That is how 2016 ended. Now, I do want to dispel the notion that Trump, the bullish, unconventional character that I mentioned in the beginning, we didn't really see that used in an effective way on Syria at all. I mean, despite the rhetoric that came from Trump about how rough he was with Syria and Iran, I think outside of the sanctions regime, the largest displacements in Syria happened under the Trump administration. Earlier this year, we saw 1 million people displaced in a matter of 3 months. That was the largest displacement we had seen in Syria since 2011. And I think oftentimes people forget that. And although sort of the lines of ceasefire, we'll call them ceasefire, have not solidified, but have remained stable over the last 9 months, since about March, since the détente between the Russians and the Turks to some extent. The stability, while there hasn't been constant and active military advances made by the Russians, the Iranians, and the Assad regime, the Assad regime has only further, entrenched its rule over a destitute country with nothing to offer its citizens. No food, no gas, no housing. In fact, it's doing quite the opposite. It is confiscating property, actively confiscating property and businesses to fund its own activities, because it is in an incredibly desperate situation due to, like I said, the one thing that I think Trump did heavily enforce during his tenure, which was the sanctions regime. At the same time, you've seen, the semi-present, permanent presence of, like you said, the Assad allies. I mean, Iran has been incredibly busy. It was something, obviously, it started through Hezbollah since 2011. That's when we first started seeing their activity in places like Homs, the province where I was born. But it has now been working really its soft power to make its presence really semi-permanent. In Syria, with its opening of schools, its charities, its businessmen, and men and women. That's all in addition to its physical military presence that, remember, Russia doesn't have. Right? Russia really operates in the skies, but it is Iran that has supported the very tattered Syrian army on the ground. So that kind of sacrifice by the Iranians needs to be noted and needs to be, looked at with very realistic lens, especially, as my colleagues have mentioned, briefly, the JCPOA, as we look to a return to that agreement. Would the US be willing to push back on Iran in other areas if the JCPOA moves forward? Now, if 2015 to 2018 is any indicator, it may not happen. But that being said, many high-level Biden officials have said in a variety of forums, most notably Jake Sullivan, that there is going to be some kind of regional track to address things like ballistic missiles and otherwise. This is obviously something that the Israelis, the Gulf countries, and the Levantine, I think, society, people in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria do want to hear. They want to see that there is some addition to that. But, it's not clear how much and to what extent we will have any influence over Iran's regional militia activity, I think, most importantly. Now, a new administration is going to probably evaluate. I think there will be, like Michelle said about, a re-examination of the Saudi policy. I do think there will be a re-examination of the Syria/Lebanon policy. I mean, we know that the Lebanon policy in and of itself is not a critical one for the United States. It's a subsection of Syria, which has now become a subsection of the Iran policy. So they're all interrelated. But the new administration will probably look and see, is 2254, the UN Security Council 2254, and the Geneva framework viable any longer? Astana process has really largely functioned without US input, and frankly, without any Arab input too. And I think this is important to recognize, because as normalization, the Abraham Accords, et cetera, take shape, there are new Arab actors, as I mentioned, that are rising to the forefront. And these Arab actors are not included in the Astana process, but they are working in ways to also secure, or to attempt to be part of regional security efforts with Israel, with other actors, and they are currently outside of that process. So I don't necessarily, Astana it has held somewhat, but I think for it to, have any influence over the medium to long term, there will be other actors vying to include themselves in that process, or maybe create separate processes outside of the Astana process that we've seen. The Turkey-US relationship, I think, under Biden will be complicated. I think, there were some leaks about President Biden, speaking about President Erdogan in a, not necessarily the most favorable light, but I think that, Turkey-US state relations, need to be, There's obviously setbacks in that relationship for a variety of legitimate concerns, right? The S-400 deal, Northeast Syria, among other issues, and Turkish expansionism also in the region as it pertains to Libya, now Armenia, Azerbaijan. So I think these are things that will be revisited by a Biden administration. And on Russia, I think the cooperation, or collaboration, or whatever, however you define our U.S.-Russia relationship, I think that will also be revisited. I think we're under no impressions that Russia is our ally or our friend, but it is physically present in many of the areas where the United States, is concerned. And so I do think that in many ways we will have to deal with them pragmatically. I think while some parts of Syria policy will probably remain the same, there will still continue to be humanitarian aid, which is not a small piece of the puzzle, right? With all of these displaced, millions of displaced in the country. I think there is likely to have some return to stabilization aid, especially as it pertains to counterterrorism efforts, and maybe some local governance. Sanctions will probably remain an important tool. Tony Blinken has said this, on the record for the Washington Post, that this will remain an important tool. I think that's very relevant to Syria and Lebanon. Used to the extent that the Trump administration, every week you have new sanctions, but I don't expect this to go away, and I don't think it should, frankly. If we are not turning to the military for solutions, I think sanctions used appropriately should remain a necessary tool on the table. And finally, I will say that I think a lot of this, the key issue will come down to whether or not the US will come to the Syria conflict with any renewed diplomatic energy. I think the Europeans have tried to some extent to sort of, keep the Syria issue afloat on their own without real US leadership on the diplomatic front, and they haven't been successful. No offense, Charles, but there's, it has been something that is, made clear that the United States should be present to move forward. And I can tell you that as someone who's participating in the Constitutional Committee, that the United States is not present there, whether by design or, whether this is just another, sort of to be expected from an administration that hasn't invested in diplomacy, writ large. There's been no achievements from that process, even though we have gathered for over a year now, nothing tangible to speak of. And so I think this will really come down to whether or not we're willing to exert any diplomatic pressure, serious diplomatic pressure, to at least find some kind of short to medium term, I would say medium term solution for the Syrian conflict, that may then over the longer term lead to the kinds of conclusions that we would like to see, democracy and all these things. I don't think I see them on the horizon anytime soon, but setting the stage is not impossible if there is some diplomatic, real diplomatic interest. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jumana. I'll also push you a little bit further if you allow, and I know it's difficult to get short answers, but this webinar is taking place from Lebanon. I'm talking to you from Beirut, and here the obsessions are a little bit different because all the obsessions are very different because we're on site. I understand you well, and I think that we already knew it, unfortunately. But Bashar al-Assad, who has survived an Obama administration, who has survived a Trump administration, could well survive a next American administration. And I think that his fate is today mainly function of the Russian will or someone else in the region. But for Lebanon, this would be hugely consequential. I don't want to characterize it more than that, but this would bear a lot of consequences for our country here. What is, if any, what has been said or what is said in the Biden campaign, in the democratic circles about Lebanon per se? Is Lebanon going to remain as Syria has remained, a paragraph, a sub-paragraph in the overall Iranian strategy of maximal pressure? Is there something, let's say, to be expected on Lebanon per se? How will the Biden administration approach the issue of Hezbollah? Can you say a few words about this?
Sure.
We'll get back to that in the discussion, of course, because this is crucial for the people who are listening to us and for us all also.
Sure. I mean, listen, obviously this is just my own sort of observations. I do think there will be some, you know, return to more traditional, I think, Obama or Democratic policies towards Lebanon. I don't expect it to be a confrontational approach with Hezbollah, not nearly to the extent that we've seen under the Trump administration. You know, I think that there's been a lot of talk about, you know, the civil society and whether or not it has been, and I say that in a very broad terms, right? So just not the immediate elite political class. But, you know, I think while there might be a desire to want to support, you know, those who are outside of that political class, I think there would be probably, or should be a revisit to what extent our financial support to those institutions will actually be able to produce the kinds of, how do you say, the positive energy I think needed to move Lebanon forward in the right direction. I think there, you know, I think part of this comes down to also, you know, that what, I mean, there are, I think, I see that most of the conversations around Lebanon really concern, for example, the LAF support to the Lebanese armed forces. I don't expect that support to be cut off. I think that was, if we were going to see that, we would have seen that, I think, in a Trump administration. But reevaluating, you know, like I said earlier, and what Michelle said, really reevaluating where is our money going to, and are these people really, you know, these institutions, organizations really moving the needle forward, or are we deluding ourselves into believing that they are? And I think that will be an important part of a responsible American foreign policy moving forward. I don't, like I said, I don't expect, for example, the institutions like MEPI or that MEPI-like, right, where you provide democracy building. I don't expect, I mean, most of that is kind of run out, or has been cut off during the Trump administration. I expect some of that to return. But, you know, it's my hope that that is invested in more, you know, in people or institutions that we believe do see eye to eye with us and can move the needle forward. And if not, then maybe we shouldn't just continue to throw money forward. Looking at humanitarian issues, that's important. But some of this is going to require patience, I think, on behalf of the people of the region, and also some soul searching. I mean, I said this in another panel for the Lebanese American University a few weeks ago, but I think one thing I can say about, you know, different parts of the Arab world, with my conversations with a lot of the, you know, civil society activists, et cetera, is that I think, you know, my generation, let's say, knows what it does not want to see, right? They know that they don't want to see, you know, endless dictatorships and lack of development opportunities and constant brain drain in the countries. But there has yet to emerge, I think, solid, for example, political parties and ideological frameworks of what my generation does want to see. And a big part of that is because they did live for an extended period of time. It's to be expected, right? But now even there is a lot of sort of I mean, this is the phase, I think, where those ideas need to grow and also gain followers, right? Gain a critical mass of following, and really to see those visionaries that can move this needle, not just in the streets, but to be able to actually engineer that to finally take them into, you know, political positions and institutions.
Okay, thank you, Jumana. Charles, now to you. I'll approach your section with, I mean, a continuation of this discussion on Iran. You know that this part of the world, mainly the Levant and us in Lebanon here, this is the obsessive question. I mean, everything is predicated on what will happen between the new administration and Iran if something happens, because also we must not rule out the possibility that nothing happens also, and we continue in that kind of no war, no peace situation. But let me approach Iran with you from something you know better than others maybe, which is the transnational relation. You know that one of the reproaches that Europe has made to the Trump administration is that it has torn up the GCPOA, that took a lot of efforts from the European and the international community to be reached. And then now we're left without a framework with Iran. If the new administration wants to get back to a sort of GCPOA or GCPOA plus, of course, it will have to bring the Europeans on board, but at the same time, without giving them too much concessions in order not to give up too much to Tehran after, as Michel has said, certain benefits from the Trump administration has been registered. I mean, of course, everything that Trump has done is not to be squandered. Some of them have to be maybe utilized. And one of them is definitely the huge leverage that Washington has imposed on Tehran that would bring it to a more amenable position. How do you see the chances of the Biden administration quite quickly re-engaging with Iran? Under which condition, and what are the probabilities or the odds of success to that, i.e. reaching a GCPOA plus that would add to the nuclear component the ballistic and the regional behavior that has to do with, of course, Iran's might and sometimes overmight on Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and other countries of the region. How do you achieve that?
That's an easy question. I'll to be on this one. I think one thing the U.S. have managed to do during the Trump administration is to protect the framework, legally speaking, as the GCPOA. And conceptually speaking, you may remember the proposal from President Macron about the 4-point plan for a meeting between Trump and Rouhani. The meeting did not happen, but the framework and the conceptual framework is still there. So I think when we look at the Biden administration and how it could look like, it's safe to say that the framework is there, and it's, I think, consensual and clear for everybody in the region that you cannot just reproduce 2013 or 2015 with like secret negotiations in Oman and then just a framework just focusing on counter-proliferation. I think it's widely understood that, as you mentioned, the regional dimension has to be addressed. And this means that very tough discussions will have to take place with Israel and with the Gulf states. So I think there is a shared understanding of the challenge both in Europe and in the US, or at least in the democratic circles in that respect. But there are many obstacles. The first obstacle is, I think, related to the timeline, because the Biden administration has to wait January to be officially in place. But we know that next year, Iran has presidential elections. So this might leave just a very narrow window of opportunity for everybody to work. So there is a sense of urgency. There is a sense of urgency because of this narrow window, but also because during the Trump administration, the proliferation crisis has grown, and the risk of Iran getting the bomb is bigger today than it was at the beginning of the Trump mandate. So I think from the European perspective, the idea is that Europe has done a lot of work. Some things have been working, others not. But basically, Europe has managed to prevent this framework to be destroyed. And so there is a framework for the Biden administration to work with. And there is a need to get to work very quickly because we don't have much time. From a counter-proliferation point of view, but also from a purely political point of view. And so the timeline requires very quick decisions in that respect. We've seen the statements from Minister Zarif on the Iranian side this week, so we can feel that things are being discussed in general. So I think everybody is trying to assess what the Biden administration could do. There's a lot of uncertainty at this stage. But the second obstacle that I see, which is more, I think, going back to the process issue we've been discussing since the beginning, is that because there is now this proliferation or counter-proliferation track and the need for a regional track and also a discussion on ballistic missiles, the connection between these different tracks is conceptually very difficult to build. And no one has, found the magical solution to this. And then you could end some contradictions in the different intents expressed by the Biden team. Because on the one hand, the review of some bilateral relations, for instance, with Saudi Arabia, that have been mentioned, this review could very well smash with the kind of in-depth discussion you need with the Saudis to build the regional track with Iran. So we'll have to see how the Biden team builds coherence in these different goals it has set to itself in the region. I think some of you may have seen this week different op-eds and articles published by very high level people in Europe. Foreign Minister Maas from Germany, French Foreign Minister Le Drian have published a joint op-ed about how to reset the transatlantic partnership and having a better and more functioning relationship when it comes to the JCPOA and the nuclear deal was part of the points they mentioned. The High Representative of the EU, Borrell, also wrote or made an interview in American press, I think it was the Washington Post as well, to express the willingness to work with. So the Europeans will be very, ready to work with the Biden administration to have a constructive relationship and, put some diplomatic energy in a framework that is there, but has been kind of abandoned by the US administration. So this is a very complex equation, but I think there is a lot of potential in the first 6 months of the Biden administration to see constructive and useful discussions. How the Iranians will play these 6 months, knowing their domestic context, will be very important to watch and understand. And the last point I would mention on this is that because the region has changed so much in the recent years, I think it's important to be aware that people are not going to wait for the US. We've been seeing a lot of strategic surprises or fait accompli from a number of players, including Russia, but also Turkey, Iran, other actors in the region. And so there is also a risk or a possibility that by the time the Biden administration comes in, the strategic situation in the region has changed because a number of players have been trying to shape things in a way that is kind of imposing a new context to the Biden administration. So to put it shortly, diplomats have a huge space and a lot of work to do on all these issues, but things are going so fast that we're not sure yet exactly where we will be in January or February. And depending on how fast is the transition in the US, how fast the administration is put in place, this will affect the level playing field dramatically. And one last point, I think, in this, that's a point I've made in different papers, but a key element for reset of the US approach to the region is also maybe to transit from a purely or mostly bilateral method to a truly multilateral method. We've been, I've been studying US diplomacy in the Middle East, being framed by a very strong bilateral relation with Israel, a very strong bilateral relation with Egypt, the Saudis, with Turkey, with other countries. And I understand the history of this. But if we're talking about dealing with a really big issue like nuclear proliferation and regional conflict with all the balance of power at stake, this needs a renewed way of doing multilateralism with everybody on board. Europe has a very big role to play in this because of the Security Council, but also because of the economic role it could play, and because of the UK and France being nuclear power. But it involves a lot of players, China, Russia, and this is a very large table I guess the table is much bigger than it used to be in the 90s, but that's the table we should all look at to try to first get de-escalation, to freeze a couple of issues that could just explode, then to try to work slowly but steadily on a number of long-term issues.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. A lot of things to discuss. We'll get again on these points. Some of them have to do with certain aspects that Aaron or Michelle have highlighted, like the bandwidth and the appetite, the stomach that is still in Washington or elsewhere to tackle global affairs in a time where national egoism or selfishness is today rising. But let me pursue on this Iranian discussion, because I think this is really the core of the issue and probably the lock and the key to a lot of other issues in the area. And here I'll engage all of you in the discussion. But to you, Charles, very quickly, I mean, the main criticism that is addressed is that maybe under Trump, the US overused sticks in the approach towards Iran, whereby the Europeans are overusing carrots. And some balance between sticks and carrots is probably to be found. And this is what is expected from the new administration. To paraphrase that, and this is the question to all of you, I received 2 questions today for this webinar from Lebanon, and they are both really diametrically opposed, but both are sound and probably conceptually right. One of them, Nora Bustani, our friend Nora Bustani, former Washington Post journalist and correspondent to the country here, to Lebanon, told me that, in fact, Obama probably gave too many gifts to the Tehran regime, at least financially. And she quoted this Politico, you know, the recent paper in Politico saying how, in fact, a huge amount of money reached Tehran and, in fact, benefited to the rejuvenation of the regional policies, the malevolent regional policies of Iran in the region. Whereby another question coming from Jad Osta, also another friend of us here in Lebanon, was also rightly saying that the sanctions and the strangulation against Iran, in fact, ultimately benefited the radicals in Iran and sidelined people like Rouhani and advocates of the nuclear deal. And probably a Trump reopening of the negotiation would empower, let's say, reformists or negotiators versus hardliners, pasdarans, and etc. Both approaches are true, in fact, and bear some reality. But I think that if you have to find a balance between both, you get back to this issue of sticks and carrot that is not only something between Brussels and Washington, but in Washington itself. So very quickly, each of you, what is your take on that? And this question of balance between sticks and carrot and how to really approach Iran, whereby we know the cynicism of the rulers in Tehran and the fact that, in fact, once they have pocketed the nuclear deal, all other issues were not on the table anymore. Charles, would you start?
Yeah, I mean, the notion that Europe has been soft on Iran has been used a lot by the Trump administration. But I mean, if you go back to the JCPOA negotiation, it's actually the French foreign minister at that time who blocked the first version of the deal to tighten some of the conditions and make sure we had a very robust architecture. So I think the discussion on sanctions, on carrot and sticks, has to be taken as a whole. And the criticism the Europe had on the maximum pressure policy was not so much that it was putting pressure on Tehran, is that the way it was shaped was not creating any landing zone for a new negotiation. So on the one hand, the Trump administration was saying he wanted like a better deal than the JCPOA. But on the other hand, the way the maximum pressure policy was conducted did not give any room for a new negotiation. And at some point, the Europeans made a number of proposals to kind of, square the circle, but it was refused. So I think it all goes down to this kind of diplomatic process we need to renew. Obviously, a number of issues and the balance you have to find between carrot and sticks will have to be reassessed because we are in 2020 and we are preparing for the next year. So it cannot be the kind of balance and incentives and pressure you had in 2003 or in 2013. But at the end of the day, I think no one wants to see Iran, on the European and the American side, no one wants to see Iran with a bomb. That's the bottom line, and that's where the US and Europe agree. Then the tactic to actually get a robust architecture to prevent this without creating escalation in the region is an open question. And again, it's up to diplomats to get back to work very quickly on this and to find a constructive dynamic also with the other members of the P5+1, which are China and Russia. So this is tremendously complicated, but I think we've proven in the past that conceptually speaking, this is possible.
Aaron, I see you nodding a lot, so maybe you can add to that.
Look, a few points. First of all, on the issue of time in a negotiation can be an ally or it could be an adversary. Based on my experience in negotiations, the Middle East has two speeds. And only two speeds, slow and slower. The notion somehow that in the first 3 or 4 months of a Biden administration, there is going to be a major effort to engage Iran, I think you'd have to be untethered to a certain degree from what's actually happening in this country. 60 days from now, Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated the 46th president of the United States. You may have 400,000 Americans dead. You're going to face a logistics nightmare in terms of distribution of vaccine to 330 million people that is going to pose an extraordinary challenge to an administration. And the metrics by which this administration is going to be judged is COVID and economic recovery, or economic recovery and COVID. So the notion somehow that any of this is going to happen quickly, let alone before Iranian elections. I'm sure there's a debate in the Iranian political dynamic whether or not to give Rouhani any sort of victory before these elections. Why would anybody believe, given the fact that the Iranian position is for compensation and no negotiations with the Americans until there's return to the agreement, let alone all of the other problems that Charles has so eloquently identified? This is 1,000 times more complicated, in my judgment, than negotiations for the JCPOA. And it's going to involve a recalibration of whether the initial approach, which was essentially transactional, is one that could actually work. So, I do believe, and I think all of my colleagues would probably agree, that in the Middle East, Iran is the key issue for the Biden administration because it is the only issue that I could identify that could fundamentally affect American prosperity and American security and disrupt the region. And this to me is the Biden administration's core consideration, not getting distracted or preempting crises that could take them away from what their cardinal responsibility is and how they will be judged. And just additional point, no one has mentioned the degree of polarization and dysfunction that now exists in the American body politic. And if the election showed anything, it was not a repudiation of Donald Trump. At best, it was a rejection. And the odds to me are not likely high, but they're not bad, that within 4 years, Joe Biden will be a transitional figure to a return to another Republican administration. And don't think that Iran, that thinks in terms of generations, not administrations, has not factored this into their calculations. Why another deal if it looks as if you're dealing with a weak, distracted administration that could be out of power soon? So I think that the key to this is not so much clever diplomatic fixes and who's at the table, but the broader strategic and political environment that's going to color this negotiation. Sorry to drone on, Joe, but these points I think are really important to make.
Okay, Michelle, how would you weigh on that?
Okay. Look, I want to comment a little bit on what Nora Bostani asked about how maybe President Obama gave too much to Tehran in the JCPOA. What I do, I want to comment on something related to that, which is I do think that the Obama administration paid too much for the JCPOA in some critical ways. And I'm hoping that the Biden administration will be a bit more tough about this than the Obama administration was. We know that the desire for the agreement with Iran colored Obama administration decisions on Syria with tragic consequences. And then there's Yemen. You know, really another terrible tragedy. The United States never should have supported the Saudi and Emirati intervention in Yemen, which has been a failure in every way one can think of. And, you know, by the way, you know, Charles mentioned that the strategic situation in the region is changing, and that even, you know, in the transition now from Trump to Biden, there are lots of things going on where regional players are trying to get Trump or the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo and so forth, to do things that they hope will throw blocks in front of the Biden administration. And one of them is related to this idea of declaring the Houthis in Yemen a foreign terrorist organization to sort of tie the hands of the incoming Biden administration to the extent possible in regarding any future negotiations on Yemen. And then I want to mention, you know, Charles also mentioned Saudi Arabia and the negotiations with Iran. And I believe you said, Charles, that you know, a US policy review on Saudi Arabia could clash with or could impede needed consultations with Saudi Arabia on the regional aspects of any future agreement with Iran. I hope that a Biden administration, as I said, will be a bit more tough-minded than the Obama administration was about exactly this sort of thing. It's in the interests of Saudi Arabia to consult with the United States and have their thoughts regarding regional, you know, regional arrangements regarding Iran taken into account. So the idea that the United States should hold back on a policy review on Saudi Arabia in order to allow the Saudis to do what's in their own interest, or to prevent them from, as we say, cutting off their nose to spite their face by refusing to consult on Iran's regional involvement. You know, to me, this doesn't make sense. And I hope that, you know, I hope the United States will get back into some sort of agreement with Iran to limit Iran's nuclear program. And yes, I hope there will be able to be a further agreement on regional. But I hope that the Biden administration won't pay a heavy price, and an unneeded price, I think, to mollify others, you know, in the region, or to mollify Iran. I think some of these things really need to be separated a bit, and that it's very, very easy for the United States to be gullible and to pay more than it really needs to for these agreements. I hope they won't do it this time.
Okay, Michel, thank you. Jumana, this leads us to you, and probably this will be the last round of intervention. I mean, when we think about Syria, we think that probably Syria and Lebanon also are the ultimate carrots that have been given to Iran, and the price paid for the nuclear deal, as Michel has said. I mean, probably that the eagerness that the Obama administration had reaching a deal with Iran led it to probably give away Syria and ultimately Lebanon to Iran's appetite. So how, from a Syrian point of view, would you see this issue of carrots and stick? And would you expect that the balance between these two would be something at the core of the Biden administration?
So first of all, I do want to echo what Aaron said, which is, I think since you are in Lebanon, just to put this in perspective, that, oftentimes our, friends overseas think that the United States is just constantly mulling over foreign policy. And the past year has really, I mean, definitely been incredibly domestically focused. Climate change, healthcare, and the economy are, I think, three of the most important things that keep being brought up, and they're all very much domestically tied. I think outside of those three issues, in terms of foreign policy, I think China and Iran are the only two countries where there is, significant attention constantly, being given to what a Biden administration or, another, second Trump administration for the elections, what they may do in both of those two arenas. Listen, from a Syrian perspective, so, from what I've heard from the Syrians that I have spoken to and understand, of course, they do feel that, and the Lebanese as well, that they were traded for a deal that they think, was not ever the core issue of Iranian ambitions in the region. This is not a reflection necessarily of what I may personally think, may or may not think, but the likelihood of Iran using a nuclear weapon in a neighborhood that condensed and concentrated. When you listen to Syrians and Lebanese, they say they're never going to use it. So why is this the core issue? When we know they have spent generations building these militias that do impact, not only our societies, and continue to sort of institutionalize parallel states in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, but also do constantly, make it clear that they are enemies of both the United States, Israel, and other, in other situations, other allies of the United States. And so it's been, our constant focus on the nuclear weapon, an important American objective to do that, is not translating to the communities and societies overseas who think, what is the likelihood of Iran using it? We know what Iran is using today, and that's its militias. It continues to grow them. It continues to sink its teeth deeper into this ground. And, I mean, I can tell you on the Syria issue, now we're at the point where even the Syria elections in 2021, they're meaningless for many reasons, right? But even if you were to remove Assad and replace him with Ahmed, whatever, any other character, it's being perceived more and more from the Syrian perspective that Assad is not really the holder of Syria's destiny, and while Russia may be its pragmatic lawyer, his hands are more and more tied on the ground by Iranian presence, and of course those are his the Syrian oligarchy, etc., and not solely Iran, but more and more by a foreign actor that has taken this opportunity during the last 10 years to sink its teeth deeply into the Syrian landscape. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jumana. Unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up, but Charles has really asked for a very quick two fingers intervention, and then I will unfortunately conclude this very interesting panel. Charles, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll be very short because I actually agree with the point Aaron and Michel raised about how the domestic politics in the US and also the kind of trade-off that could affect the US-Saudi relation. I agree with this all the more that, as I said at the beginning, the bandwidth will be limited, and it's up to the Biden administration to see how they invest in all these layers of the problem. But one point I quickly wanted to make is that from the European perspective, what is very important is also, with all these priorities, to reassess the scale of the leverage of the US. And I think, coming back to what Jomana just said, having 500 or 1,000 US troops in northeastern Syria, as in the current context, strategic significance that is way above what Washington would usually decide. I mean, Iraq at the peak was like 100,000 troops in the country. So I think the scale of what the US wants to do, but also what it could do in the region, has changed. And so there is a need both to reassess some of these relations and some of these challenges because of this limited bandwidth, but also there can be creativity in reassessing the potential of small steps that the US can do with the Europeans, but also with their allies in the region, to actually leverage that even more than they think they could in the past.
Okay, thank you so much. Look, I'll do a very, a very difficult exercise. You can't wrap up and summarize such a discussion, but I would say that at least three takeaways stick to my mind. The first one is that despite, and besides and beyond Trump's persons and character, the world and the region are very different today than what they used to be for years ago, and we have to take this into account. The new administration will have to take a new and changed world into account. The second one is that issues are so entangled that contradictions are enormous. I mean, look at this issue of sticks and carrots. You want to reach a deal with Iran, you have to pay it for regional ambitions of Iran or not. Things will be very much under a catch-22 form, and this administration will have to be very inventive to approach that. And third, and this is probably the most important, domestic politics. Probably the bandwidth in Washington will be narrower because of what we know, COVID, economy, and etc. But also because more globally, and it has to do with the change in the global picture, the Middle East is more and more on the curve of getting devaluated as a focal point of international concern. With all this, I really thank you wholeheartedly for your participation in this webinar. IFI is very honored to have had you. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jumana. And thank you, Charles. I hope that you will accept to participate in other seminars and in other webinars in the future. And we hope to be able to welcome you physically in Beirut. This would be really an honor for us. Thank you for the audience. I'm sorry if all the questions were not tackled. I tried to integrate them in the general discussion. I wish you a good evening or a good rest of the day, and see you all soon. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Joe. So
Thank
much.
you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Bye.